Well, what a wonderful night, wouldn't you think? Absolutely. And Jacob, congratulations to you, young man. It's a little unnerving to baptize your first person, isn't it? I was, I think, 16 when I baptized my first person. And I hope that you have many years of doing things like that. Wonderful, wonderful. We are in Revelation chapter 15 for this class. So if you'll find that in your Bible, and we'll have about 25 minutes for class, and then we will come back in for our devotional period here. Although I feel like what we've had already is pretty devotional, you know what I mean? It certainly is. Chapters 15 and 16 of Revelation go together. They tell about bowls of wrath. Well, that's an interesting term, isn't it? Bowls of wrath. You think about bowls of vegetables and cereal and all of that kind of stuff. You usually don't think about bowls of wrath. Chapter 15 has the distinction of being the shortest chapter in the Bible, or in the book of Revelation, rather, the shortest chapter in the book of Revelation. And it's really a preamble to what happens in chapter 16. Chapter 15 says they're coming, and chapter 16 says here they are. So they both have to do with the same general subject matter. I think the purpose of these two chapters is to refocus the original readers on what Revelation is about. It was easy to get distracted, I think, because of all of the stuff that was going on. Christians were being persecuted. They were being killed by Rome. And after a while, after hearing, be patient, it's coming, be patient, it's coming, after a while you just say, really? Are we going to have to wait longer? And I think that Revelation 15 says, you don't have to wait much longer. It's here. The wrath of God is going to be poured out. In chapter 15, in the first verse, we find 7 angels and 7 plagues. Now, would that surprise you that we have 7 here? That's a pretty common number in Revelation, isn't it? That it indicates completeness or fullness. We've said that a number of times, that 4 was the number of completeness on the spiritual or on the physical side, and 3 was the number of completeness on the spiritual side. You had 3 in the Trinity. You had 4 corners of the earth or 4 directions. You put 4 and 3 together, you got 7, and that just meant you got it all. It's complete. It's finished. And so you have 7 angels, and notice in verse 1, it says, then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels, having the 7 last plagues, for in them the wrath of God is complete. So the 7 angels had what are referred to here as 7 plagues. Now, they're going to be referred to later in the chapter, 7 bowls of wrath, so it's not 2 different things. It's just 2 different designations for the same thing. 7 plagues, 7 bowls of wrath. The original readers, now if you could transport yourself back into the first century, and you are a Christian, probably with a Jewish background, and you are familiar with the Old Testament, and somebody says plagues, what's the first thing you're going to think about? That's exactly right, Jeff. The Exodus out of Egypt. When Pharaoh wasn't too keen on letting the Israelites go because they were good, cheap labor. And so God visited 7 different or 10 different plagues on them. After each one, Pharaoh was ready, and then he decided he wasn't. Another plague came, and he decided he was ready, and then he decided he wasn't. And So it was that way throughout the plagues. So the original readers, when they heard plagues, would have said, yeah, we know about that. And what was the significance on the other side of the plagues? Deliverance. That's exactly it. That's the term. Deliverance. Following the 10 plagues would come deliverance. What's the message here? Following the 7 plagues will come deliverance. And they understood that. They understood that the purpose of the plagues was to bring about deliverance. And in these plagues, we see the wrath of God. It's complete. It's unleashed against the people. Now, as I said, chapter 15, verse 7 calls them golden bowls of wrath, or chapter 5 and verse 7 had referred to these as 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God. Is there any significance to the fact that they are golden bowls, do you think? Chapter 15, verse 7. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. What's the significance of that? Do you think? Golden bowls. You have an idea? What would golden bowls have represented, do you think? Who had golden bowls? Rich people. People of power. People of position. And so he's not putting this wrath in clay pots. He's putting this in golden bowls to signify, I think, the power, the majesty, the might of Jehovah. And so in verse 1 we find these 7 angels, 7 plagues. And there really is a connection, if you read back in Revelation to chapter 8, when we saw 7 trumpets sounded. And judgment was meted out then, if you remember. What's the difference between the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls of wrath?
Trumpets only affected part of the earth.
That's exactly right. The 7 trumpets did not affect everybody, a third of the earth, which shows that it was partial. Now, remember, apocalyptic literature, we're not to say 2 here and 1 here, so that's a third, and 2 here and 1 here, and that's a third. You just keep on going and dividing the people. It doesn't mean that. It just meant that the devastation in God's judgment was partial. When you get to the bowls of wrath, what idea do you get about the devastation? It's absolutely complete. That nobody gets away this time. There's no holding back. It is going to be complete and full. In verses 2, 3, and 4, we find an allusion to the sea of glass. And he cried mightily with a loud voice. I'm in the wrong chapter. Let me get back to chapter 15. And I saw something like a sea of glass, mingled with fire. And those who had the victory over the beast, over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name, standing on the sea of glass, having harps of God. They sang the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are your works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, O King of the saints. Who shall not fear you, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy, for all nations shall come and worship before you. For your judgments have been manifested. Now, figures. We've got to stop and understand about figures. Are we to assume that this sea of glass really is a sea of glass? we sometimes use that terminology. If you've ever been out someplace looking across a lake, you might say it was as still and smooth as glass. We're indicating there were no ripples, there were no waves. It was just a smooth observation that we're seeing. I think that this is certainly figurative here, and notice it doesn't say really a sea of glass anyway. It says something like a sea of glass. So what was it? Something like a sea of glass. If we go any further than that, we're running into wild guesses, don't you think? We can only stick with what is revealed here. It was something like a sea of glass. And we notice the victorious are there. And notice how the victorious are described. They have the victory over the beast, over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name. And they're standing on the sea of glass having harps of God. Now, all of the imagery here, the language, refers to Rome and the rulers of Rome. We've said the beast is Rome or the emperor. The image of his beast would be the idols. His mark, that was the mark that they bore that indicated they could do business. And over the number of his name, what was the number of his name? That number that kind of scares us to death. 666, that's right. So these are winners. And notice where they are. They're standing on the sea of glass. Some translations will say by the sea of glass, and that may be a better translation. The word that is translated there can go either way. One of the hard things to do, and I've said this a number of times, is translate another language, one language into another one. Because sometimes there aren't comparable phrases or words. Like we don't have a word for that. I was reading a story of a tribe in Africa that had received the gospel. And the fellow was talking about slavery. And they said, we don't understand this term slavery. And so he explained it to them. And they said, oh, you mean foot on my neck. And so in their language, somebody was down there and the master put his foot on their neck and ruled over them in a very harsh way. So slavery to them was foot on my neck. It can be that hard. We're trying to translate Greek into English, and so this can go by or on. I think, personally, that the better translation is by, and I'll tell you why. I think the parallel here, what we've had already, is a lot of this parallelism between what's going on and the exodus out of Israel, or out of Egypt, to go to Egypt, to Israel. What was the separation between the enemies of God and God's people?
In the Old Testament, it was the Red Sea.
It was water. As they came out of Egypt, first of all, it was the Red Sea. And they went through that. And when they finally got to the Promised Land, it was the Jordan River. And they crossed that. So, in my judgment, I would say it's by the sea of glass, and the sea of glass just stands for what divided the enemies of God and the people of God. Where were the people of God on the other side? They were delivered. That's the whole idea. Now, this term harps. And folks who believe, and I think most of you know, that we have a cappella music, vocal music in churches of Christ. And that's surprising to some people. Although I will tell you, and many of you know this, but the word a cappella itself means in the manner of the church. It means chapel style music. So just when you say a cappella, what are you saying? That's church music. That's chapel style music. And some people who try to justify instrumental music in worship say, but there were harps in Revelation. Does that wash? Is that a good argument? I see people going this way, then tell me why it's not a good argument.
It's figurative language.
Figurative language. If everything else is figurative, isn't it kind of strange to go down and find, okay, literal, like the seven's figurative, the bowls of wrath, that's figurative, the sea of glass, like sea of glass, it even says like sea of glass is a figurative thing, but harps, buddy, that's literal. That's just not good Bible study. We don't get the right to go through, say, figurative, figurative, literal, figurative, figurative, literal, when we want it to be literal. What would a harp represent?
Praise.
Honor and praise. All you have to do, go back, and who do you think of in the Old Testament when you think of harp? David, right? He was proficient on playing the harp, and when King Saul, before they had their big fallout, got all concerned about what was going on, he would call for David to come and play his harp for him to calm his spirit. So a harp signifies calmness, worship, praise. One of the things that Sierra and I enjoyed, I remember this, I don't know if you do, Sierra, but I expect your memory is better than mine, thankfully. But I was in a meeting in Nashville, and some of the people told us they had given us a food allowance, and they said, you need to go to, was it Opryland? And said there's a program there where you can have dinner and a fellow plays a harp. And we said, that's pretty expensive. And they said, that's our dollar, go eat. And so we did. And this fella came out and played the harp while we were eating. It was one of the most beautiful, calming, wonderful experiences. And especially on somebody else's dollar, you know, you like that part of it. And harp just signifies that. And so I think the harp is as figurative as anything else. And then what they were singing. Now this is another allusion back to the Exodus. You can read about it in chapter 14, going through chapter 15. They sang the song of Moses. Well, what was the song of Moses all about?
Deliverance.
When they got to the other side of the Red Sea, Moses gave a song. It was a song of like, look where we are. You know, just before this, they had been back in Egypt, servants, and now they had crossed the sea of glass, so to speak, and they were on the other side, victorious, and Moses composed a song that they sang. And here the people are singing the song of Moses. Now, to a Roman who's reading this, what's he thinking about now?
Those are crazy people.
These guys are crazy. I mean, they've talked about bowls of wrath, and they've talked about a sea that's like glass, and they've talked about the beast, and now they're singing a song. They would not have understood the terminology. They would not have understood the meaning at all. That these people were now delivered. Now, if you're an original reader, how are you feeling about now? I think there's some real hope here. I think we have something to look forward to because we're talking victory now. We're talking crossing the sea of glass. We're talking about singing the song of Moses. Now, it's interesting to me that Moses and the Lamb are mentioned together. They sang the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. What was the connection of Moses and the Lamb? They were both deliverers. Moses had delivered them from Egyptian bondage. Christ delivered us from sin. So a song of victory had real meaning to them. It reminded them of Moses and his song, but it also pointed them to the one who would give them real victory, and that was Christ. George Ladd, I thought was interesting on this, called this the most moving expression of faith in the entire biblical literature. Great and marvelous are your works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, O King of the saints. Who shall not fear you, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. For all nations shall come and worship before you, and your judgments have been manifested. That's pretty high praise, isn't it, right there? Praising God. Okay, questions so far, comments, observations? Yes?
Would this song of Moses be the same song of Moses that's mentioned in Deuteronomy?
Is it the same song that's mentioned? It's a shortened version. It's a microwave version. It's a part of it. Okay?
Man is named that the song of Moses.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. We've got like 3 or 4 minutes. Let's go ahead with verses 5 through 8. I don't know that we'll get them completely covered, but let's at least read them. And it says, after these things, I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened. And out of the temple came the 7 angels, having the 7 plagues, clothed in pure bright linen, having their chests girded with golden bowls. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God, who lives and abides forever. The temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no one was able to enter the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels was completed. Now, what's interesting, I think, is that the chapter opens with this idea of the angels and the bowls of wrath of the plagues, and you almost think, well, they'll go right into that. But they don't go right into it. He's got some groundwork to lay here to encourage the people about deliverance, and now he goes back to the idea of the angels and the bowls of wrath. It continues with the Exodus symbolism. And he does that by talking about the temple and the tabernacle. The temple of the tabernacle, which is just very interesting, I think. We do not generally equate temple and tabernacle as being at the same time. Which one was first? Tabernacle. The tabernacle was the tent where God met the people, where God was worshipped. We've talked about that. The first part of it was the holy place. The smaller part in the back was the most holy. When they became permanently settled in Canaan, then they built a permanent place, and it was called the temple. And it was set up much the same way. with the holy place, and then the Holy of Holies. And both of them represented God's presence among the people. Do you know where the tabernacle was set up when they made camp? Where would you guess?
It's in the center and all the tribes would face.
In the very middle of the encampment. It wasn't off. Nobody got an advantage over anybody else. It was the central thing in the camp that was set up by the Israelites. And they camped the tribes around it. And I think it was there to be predominant. We're out of time. But I appreciate you being with me. And young people, I'm sorry that you did not get to have your class tonight. Mr. Gary is sick and not able to be here. And we'll get him back with you next week. But thanks for being in this class. And we'll have a devotional period now. When we get all the classes in here, we'll be ready to go on home for the night after that. But it's been a great night. I think you will all agree. Terrific.